gold trails and ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, and today we're talking about really a remarkable force in the world, and it really had its origins, 1873, the NWMP.
Yeah, the Northwest Mounted Police. I have lots of time for the history of the force and for the force itself. And Mike, when they really governed the West, they were the law in the West. And there's not much doubt about it. When you look back at the history of the force, you find they stayed right with their motto, maintain la droit, maintain the right. And they did that for 50 cents a day. Started at 75 cents a day for a constable or sub-constable, and eventually went down to 50 cents a day. You know, that's really quite remarkable. And in doing that, they governed in places where most people hadn't been, right from the Great Plains, right into the Northwest. That is the Yukon Territory, northern British Columbia, and so on. And they were really quite unique. There's not much doubt about it. One of the inspectors in the Northwest, a guy called Constantine, Charles Constantine, went into 40 Mile when 40 Mile was
where is 40 Mile?
Beyond Dawson City, close to the Alaska border. And he said, I'm chief magistrate here in 40 Mile, and I'm commander-in-chief, and I'm foreign secretary as well. I am the law. And a little high-handed occasionally, but not too often. Yeah. And they wore the red serge, and they wore the red serge for a reason.
I got the red serge for him, as a matter of fact, here. What was the, all British forces seem to me to be partial to red serge.
Well, the reason the Northwest Mounted Police came in, into the West was to show the difference between the British police or the Canadian police and the American Army. The American Army wore blue, so the blue coats weren't well liked by the Indians of the Great Plains, and this was an indicator of right and some might as well. So it's kind of interesting.
Were they? Were more respected? When the residents, when the native people of the prairies saw the red serge?
Yeah, well, there's a famous story that some of the Mounties in winter gear, and they had blue overcoats on, came into an Indian camp on the Great Plains, and it was probably near Fort Walsh somewhere, and the Indians thought they were Americans, and they leveled all their rifles at them, and they had some Winchesters and some good rifles as well, and then the Mounties just threw back their overcoats and showed the red serge, and the Indians put down their rifles and smoked the pipe of peace.
So then were they fair?
Very definitely. Very, very few cases. It's funny, there's an old saying in the force, and one of the original superintendents of the force said, this should be the hardest force in the world to get into and the easiest to get out of. So if somebody went AWOL, Mike, they didn't care. He wasn't worth keeping in this magnificent force.
That kind of esprit de corps was throughout the area of their responsibility.
Yeah, very few flaws, occasionally here and there, but compared with police forces all around the world, magnificent record.
Now, there is one not full-time, full-fledged Northwest Mounted Policeman that we're going to be talking about today, and a great story, just an amazing story of tracking and clue gathering.
Yeah, the guy was really quite original. His name was Jerry Potts.
Okay, we'll do that. Right after this break, Jerry Potts' guide for the Northwest Mounted Police right after these words.
Is shiny.
Professional, affordable, new, très aimé.
Très aimé, le très aimé, ooh la la.
Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee talking about the Northwest Mounted Police today. A huge story, but we have two really neat stories to tell. And Jerry Potts, to your mind, was one phenomenal character.
Oh, yeah. Jerry Potts was never a member of the Northwest Mounted Police, but they treated him like a member. In fact, they treated him better than a member. And the reason is very obvious. In 1874, just after the force was formed, they had the Great March West. And about 300 constables under George French, superintendent, and a guy called McLeod, who later became a superintendent of the Northwest Mounted Police, went out onto the Great Plains. They were not familiar with the Great Plains. Now, this is very interesting because most of these individuals were youngest sons, so there was no estate for them in England, and many of them had been sent to Canada. This was adventure at its best, its very best.
Were most of them English?
Yeah, a lot of them were English, some French, a few Ukrainians, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And
Scottish, Irish?
yeah,
were they?
some Scottish, some Irish, not too many Irish, but some. And so they moved out onto the Great Plains in force, and with cannon, each armed with a revolver and a rifle. And they got out into Alberta, what is now present Alberta, and that was the Northwest then. And frankly, they were in trouble. So they heard of a guide in Montana. And a French sent down McLeod, who was the second in command, into Montana. And they came across a bandy-legged little guy called Jerry Potts. Now, Jerry Potts at that time had a blood mother and an American father who worked for the American Fur Trading Company. And his father was killed by an Indian, a pagan Indian, when he was 5 years old. So he was brought up with two stepfathers. And one of them was called the last king of the West. And he taught him a lot. And he was a Métis, of course, because of the mixed blood. And he taught him, to speak English well, which he did, to speak French, which he did, to speak Blackfoot, which he did, to speak Sioux, to speak Cree, speak all the Plains Indian languages. And when you're stuck there, then he went to the High Plains Sign Language. So he could converse with anybody on the plains. Very interesting individual. He was, and when you look at Jerry Potts, you don't see somebody impressive. They were extremely impressed with this guy.
Now, the fact that there would be a photograph of him
Yeah.
in 1874 is
Yeah.
a sign that this guy is a phenomenal character.
Yeah, and he's still dressed in essentially Indian garb, Indian or Métis garb. And he had led, and when he was a kid, he'd had a recurring dream that a cat would save his life.
A cat.
So he skinned a cat and put it under his vest. So this picture you're seeing is under that vest is a cat skin. He carried it all his life, was never scratched in battle. And he had, prior to the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police, been in many pitched battles, usually in the front of the battle, was never scratched. A very interesting guy. He was a superb guide. He knew the West like the back of his hand. It was just like an open map for him, Mike. It really was. He could find water, he could find buffalo, he could find grazing land. In an absolute blinding snowstorm, he was the only guy who knew exactly where he was going when you couldn't see 3 feet in front of you. And remember, this is the Great Plains. And at that time, the Indians are still holding sway on the Great Plains. The Blackfoot still have their confederacy, the pagans, and the Bloods. The Sioux are just south of the line. And so you have great chiefs like Crowfoot. You have Sitting Bull, who came north of the line after the Custer Massacre and settled around Fort Walsh to be protected by the Canadians. 3,000 Sioux over there. And there was a lot of animosity between the Sioux and the Blackfoot. Now, these pictures show the Blackfoot as they would appear around the turn of the century, just after the turn of the century, a couple of these just before, including the famous Sundance. So this is what he is. He is trying to cement relations between the Indians of the Great Plains and between the Northwest Mounted Police.
So McLeod meets him in Montana.
Sure.
Does he check out his credentials? I mean, this is an amazing thing to say about a man. And they, hire him immediately?
Well, they hire him, actually. The constables at this time were getting, full constables getting $1, sub-constables getting 75 cents. Later, that was reduced to 75 cents and 50 cents, which is ridiculous. And the commissioners got somewhere around $1,200 a year. That's all. So they hired Jerry Potts at $90 a month. Now, $90 a month was as much as the commissioner was worth.
Gee.
I mean, this is incredible. But he did have a flaw. He did everything right, but once in a while he'd go on a spree. And sometimes those sprees were rather prolonged, Mike. Indeed, they were. And he would drink extract of lemon. He would drink painkiller. He liked to drink scotch. There wasn't much up there. He would occasionally even stoop to drinking red ink. Anything that was colored, he figured it was alcohol. So he had some drawbacks. And the problem was is they'd have to let him go for a month at a time until he got over this spree. But they always brought him back into the force because of his value.
Now, what did he handle of importance for the
Well,
Northwest
he
Mounted
handled
Police?
everything. He was an interpreter, a master interpreter. And at that time, the Indian nations, when they met the Mounted Police, usually was passing the pipe, the peace pipe around the circle, and then the chief, probably not the war chief, but the actual chief, would talk for significant length of time. This was a social occasion, Mike. So they would, in fact, several times. Once one of the chiefs got up and talked for 90 minutes without stopping, and with all the gestures and everything else. And so finally, when the chief sat down, the mounted police officer turned, and it was probably McLeod, turned to Jerry Potts and says, "What did you say, Jerry?" And this is after 90 minutes of steady talking. He says, "He's glad you're here." Another time, one of the chiefs talks for 2 hours, and they said all through it, it's part of the formal occasion of the day, and they said all through it, and the chief sits down, and he says to Jerry, he says, "What did he say, Jerry?" "He wants grub." So this guy
So Jerry was an editor, too?
Oh, sure he was. And Jerry could track anybody. If there was an outlaw on the loose, Jerry could track him. And nobody really touched this guy in the entire Northwest. So he had a significant role to play. He was treated as a mounted policeman, never dressed in the mounted police garb, of course, or the uniform. And he finally died in, 1896, I think May the 14th, if I remember correctly. And surprisingly, a civilian associated with the force, they gave him full military burial, full Northwest Mounted Police burial. And his grave is actually at Fort McLeod now. So they buried him with full military honors, fired 3 volleys over his grave, and that was the end of Jerry Potts. But his legend really lives on.
Now, if we think about the tracking ability and the capabilities he had,
Sure.
do you think by any chance that this next story we're going to tell, that the constable had any exposure to Jerry Potts? Was he listening carefully? Was there any indication of that?
Yeah, he probably had met Jerry Potts, and he was just as good as Jerry Potts in his own way. His name was Pennychuck. A fascinating individual.
Okay, we're going to take a break here. Come back and tell the story about Constable Pennychuck and the solution to an amazing murder case right after this break.
Smirnov, what's your mix?
Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking about the Northwest Mounted Police, and we're heading to Dawson, circa 1898.
Yeah, Dawson, that's the high year in Dawson, Mike. Dawson is booming. And it is about 30,000 people. It's really, you have about 4 or 5 options in Dawson. You're a businessman, you're a hotel owner, you're a miner, or you're a gambler. And most of them do well. Some of the miners don't do well. Some of the gamblers do very, very well. Some don't do so well. And we talked before about Louis Golden and Silent Sam Bonifield and Swiftwater Bill Gates and so on. All of those guys went broke. Only Jack Marchbanks didn't. He ended up with $5 million.
Isn't there one guy who lost an unspectacular amount of money?
Oh, yeah, well, sure. Louis Golden lost $180,000 and in one shot at Faro, played 72 hours in a row, couldn't even stand on his feet. That's equivalent to losing over $7 million today.
Nice looking little wheel here. This is Crown and Anchor?
Crown and Anchor.
Any way you can win Crown and Anchor?
No, in the long run, they always get you.
Yeah?
Every wheel gets you. It's whether it's roulette or Crown and Anchor, Faro, you name it. And they'll always get you.
So in this context, we've got either people who are successes at
Sure.
mining, hoteling,
Sure.
Gambling, or
Yeah.
they turn to crime.
And we're talking about a gambler who also turned to crime, a guy named O'Brien. And the story really starts, Mike, in Dawson in 1898. It's Christmas Day. 3 individuals start out from Dawson heading for Whitehorse. Now, it's Christmas Day, and the police track virtually everybody who leaves Dawson on a long trip. A lot of people didn't know that. And so then the 3 individuals are rather interesting. A guy called Olson, who's a telegraph line repairman. He hasn't got much money. He's accompanied by a guy called Ralph. And Ralph is a caller off on the dance floors. He tells people to get off the floor, their time's up. He has a fair amount of money, and he has a very unique gold nugget, which looks like a human hand with a nugget in the hand. And he also has a strange silver coin. I think it was a Mexican silver coin, and some cash as well as some gold dust. And the 3rd individual is very, very important. He's a guy called Frank Clayson. Frank Clayson was a businessman out of Seattle. He has a lot of bills on his person, and he's very, very well off. He's coming to Dawson. Now he's leaving Dawson with a lot of cash, and he's heading back to Whitehorse. So they start on up the river, and they go to a little place called Minto, or very close to Minto, and they come to a place called Fossil's Roadhouse. And there are roadhouses all the way up the Yukon. You know, people would stop, they'd travel a certain distance, spend their night in the roadhouse. There in the roadhouse is a guy sitting there. They don't even know him at all. They don't know he's been in jail in Dawson City. This is O'Brien. He has doubled back to this stopping place. So O'Brien talks very well. He's easy to get along with, so he teams up with them. And now the story takes a jump. So they leave the next morning. They go on up the Yukon River. Now we go right up to Fort Tagish. Here's Fort Tagish in about 1899.
Sometime after Christmas.
That's right, 10 days after Christmas. And everyone, when they came by Fort Tagish, they automatically stopped in at the fort. What's the weather like? Are there any dangers ahead? How's the ice? And so on. The mounted police are sitting in Fort Tagish, Northwest Mounted Police, they're looking out there, and they see a guy come up to the fort, stop, and he detours around the fort. He starts to detour around the fort. So they go to the commander, Darcy Strickland, and they see he's detouring around the fort. He says, go after them. So they go after this guy, and the guy, in such a hurry to get away, crashes through the ice, and his sleigh is held up. So he was driving a sleigh and a horse, and the sleigh's held up. So they bring him in for questioning, and they find, he admits his name is O'Brien, and they search him, which they're not supposed to do, but the law was a little different then, and they find a lot of bills on him, and then they go and search the sleigh, and they find a very strange nugget. They didn't know the nugget belonged to Ralph.
It's just a piece of
That's right.
something they found.
That's right, and they find more bills. So they're rather intrigued. So they bring him before the commanding officer, and Strickland says, 6 months for vagrancy, which was totally against the law, of course.
Well, he's got enough money to not be a vagrant, so Strickland knows something's going on with this guy.
He figures something's up. But they don't have any indication of that time because there's no telegraph into Fort Tagish at that time. A lot of the other posts were linked by telegraph. He is not. So he sends one constable back with O'Brien, and they take him back to Fort Selkirk. And here's Fort Selkirk, bigger post, as you can see, than Fort Tagish. And they put him in jail there. And then they hear from the mounted police downriver that they can't find any trace of the 3 individuals who'd left Dawson City. So they now begin to look very, very closely at it. They question O'Brien. He doesn't come up with any answers that they like. So they put 2 officers on it, a Sergeant Holmes and Constable Pennychuck. And Pennychuck, one of the few Ukrainians on the force at that era, very, very shrewd indeed. So he is given the task of going up the river and seeing if there's anything he can find, seeing where they've gone, if there's any indication. So he goes up that river, and he comes to the edge of the river, and he sees kind of an indentation, like somebody has dragged something down the bank into the river, and the river is frozen over, but they could have broken a hole in the ice. He's very, very shrewd. He looks around, and he notices 2 or 3 of the trees are cut to give a view upriver and to give a view downriver, Mike. He said, why would anyone want to do that? Unless they were hiding something or didn't want somebody to see them. So he looks at these and finds that there's a nick in each one of the pieces of wood that's been cut. There's 2 nicks in the upper part of the axe that was used and 1 nick in the lower part of the axe. He did not know that this axe had been given to O'Brien in Dawson City. That came out much, much later. So he cuts off that wood and takes it with him. Then he goes up the bank and he has a broom with him. And he follows this indistinct trail and he brushes that broom, comes across some frozen blood in the snow. Brushes all around it, and finds 3 .38 shells, brass shells, and he finds 1 .45 rifle shell. Now his suspicion is aroused. He goes back to Fossil's Roadhouse, stays the night, comes back the next morning, Mike. And when he comes back the next morning, he's wandering up that little trail, and the trail kind of gives out on him, and over the bank comes a dog. Well, he recognizes the dog, and the dog recognizes him. Dog wags his tail, and this was the dog that O'Brien had when he was serving time in the Dawson City jail. So he looks, he pets the dog, makes friends with the dog, and the dog liked him anyway because he had petted him before. And he says, go home, boy. And the dog goes up the bank, and he follows, right lockstep with the dog. And the dog goes, and he sniffs around, and he comes out to a kind of a tent log cabin. Lower part is logs, upper part is tent. He goes inside. There's the .45 rifle and a stove. He looks in the stove, sifts some of the stuff on the stove, comes across buttons, comes across this and that, and bits of clothing, that's all. He goes outside. Pennychuck's very shrewd indeed. He takes some heavy objects out of his pocket, he takes some coins, and he takes a couple of keys, and as he steps out the door, he throws them out in the snow. Then he goes and brushes the snow. He finds all the stuff that he threw out. He also finds a silver coin, a Mexican silver coin. And that's very unusual. And he also finds a small strongbox key. And the strongbox key, he didn't know at the time, was from Seattle. He suspects it, but it was a strongbox key that belonged to Clayson. So he brings all this stuff back, and he looks at it, and he starts sorting out the evidence. They go back and see O'Brien, and they start locking in on him. They find out that the notes, all the notes, were recognized at Fossil's Roadhouse, and they had belonged to Clayson. Ralph had shown the nugget to a number of people before he met O'Brien at Fossils Roadhouse. So O'Brien is absolutely linked in with the crime, Mike. No doubt about it at all. So they spent about a year and a half putting it all together. He's defended ably, but the circumstantial evidence is simply overwhelming. Everything locks in with O'Brien. He's taken to Dawson City. He is sentenced to be hanged by the magistrate there. And they send out an invitation to all the prominent people in Dawson to come and see the hanging. And there was a reason for that. The reason is they wanted everyone to know in Dawson City that you couldn't get away with a crime in the Canadian Northwest or in the Yukon Territory. And one of my friends actually has the invitation. I haven't got it here.
So even though it took them a year and a half,
Yeah.
they stuck with the case, got all the circumstantial
Yeah,
evidence.
they did.
Now this guy Pennychuck, how much training was a constable in the RCMP given? How did he know to look at axe choppings, to do this sweeping of the area?
Yeah.
When we were talking about Jerry Potts, did Potts use these same techniques?
No, he wasn't in criminal investigation, usually Potts. He would lead them into criminals, but it wasn't in criminal investigation. And actually, Pennychuck solved another crime, the Cash Hell case in Alberta, some years later, where he tracked an American murderer and brought him to justice as well. So Pennychuck goes through the force all the time. I don't think he made senior rank, which is interesting, but he was perhaps one of their best detectives, but he wasn't alone. A number of them. Another one of the mounted police went down into Montana, tracing a killer out of Ponoka, Alberta, and he recognized his handwriting on a note he had. He looked at every hotel register in Montana and the state of Idaho and all the way through until he saw writing that was similar. And finally put his hand on the guy's shoulder and said, excuse me, not on his shoulder. He called the guy, he says, Bullock, and the guy turned around. And he says, I'm not Bullock. He says, oh, yes, you are. He says, arrest you for murder in Ponoka, Alberta. And
this is how the Northwest Mounted Police and the RCMP got to always get their man.
Yeah, that's overstated. They don't always get their man, but I think when you compare it with other forces in the world, perhaps Scotland Yard, they usually do. They were very, very successful, especially in the early years.
I just find that fascinating because Christmas they leave.
Yeah.
10 days later, no one shows up.
That's right.
15 days later, Pennychuck comes on the case,
Yeah.
retracts, maybe 20 days later,
Yeah.
sweeps the bank,
Sure.
finds the shells, finds the frozen
Yep.
blood. I mean, what a piece of determined, diligent work.
Yeah, he also recognized that because of the fragments he found in the fire that they'd been shot with the pistol at first and then dispatched with the rifle.
Did they ever find Clayson or the bodies of any of these people?
Yeah, actually they found two of them later on the Yukon River and one about a year and a half later. So they identified all of them.
For heaven's sakes. Great stories. Pennychuck, the constable, and seeks out and solves that case.
Yeah.
And Jerry Potts, the great prairie guide.
That's right.
That's tremendous. Thank you very much, Bill.
You're welcome, Mike.
We've got to tell a few more of those. Did Darcy Strickland, you didn't mention this time, he's your great-grandfather or what, great-grand-uncle?
Yeah, he was my great-uncle. He was in charge of Tagish folks.
As accounts for your abiding interest in the family, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The story has been of the Northwest Mounted Police. Just a couple of stories and a few sidebars to some of the great stories with the Northwest Mounted Police dating back to 1874. We'll see you again next time when Gold Trails and Ghost Towns return. See you then.